All right, here with me today, I've got Steve. Steve, how do you pronounce your last name? Because I never get it right.
Chilcote.
Chilcote.
Just like it's spelled.
Yeah, just like it's spelled, but it's just like those phone announcers who can never get your name right. I'm just as bad.
People try to make more out of it than what it is.
So I got Steve with me here, and Steve, you are a professional forester and land consultant. Is that right?
Yes, I'm a realtor, wildlife habitat consultant. My original degree here at Penn State was in wildlife management, and then I got into real estate. Then I got into forestry through real estate,
right?
Because I worked for a big land company. I did some development, and we would find higher and better used properties. Stuff with waterfalls and rivers. And we had lake frontage, and we'd divide some of that stuff off and sell it. So I was in charge of doing all that, and then I got really interested in forestry. And then I got invited to work on my master's here at Penn State, and I got a master's in forestry.
So you've kind of been at Penn State your whole entire career?
Yeah, 2 degrees from there.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So, and along the way, you're no different than any of us that listen to this, or me myself. You're avid hunter, just the same.
Yeah. I'm slowing down a little bit, but I was crazy. I hunted all over the place. Hunted all the time.
Okay.
All my life.
Do you have you been a little bit more interested in whitetails, or are you been a little more interested in small game, or what's been your driving force behind all that?
Well, I used to have, when I was a kid, of course, I had the big dream of going to Africa and going to Alaska and all that. And I actually, after college, I went out and did some guiding in the Rockies. That was a lot of fun. And so I've been elk hunting, I've been moose hunting up in Alaska. Wow. And have never been to Africa, but maybe someday.
I went to Africa for my honeymoon. It was a blast.
Cool.
It was.
Yeah, I know a guy who goes all the time, a seed dealer. He's always going to Africa every couple of years.
Wow. So with the jobs that you're doing, so you're doing some forestry consulting, you're doing a little bit of wildlife consulting. Can you just go into a little bit more detail right now what some of them jobs look like? And maybe tap into, you have a YouTube channel too, and kind of just talk a little bit about that.
Forestry YouTube channel. I have a couple of playlists on there. A couple of them are about real estate. I have a forestry playlist. Then I have a food plots playlist, and some things thrown in there in between. But most of the people that I work with in the field are guys who either want to buy some land to hunt on, or just bought land, and they want to have somebody come in and advise them on how to make it better for hunting. Because we're shifting in this country from purchasing land as a timber investment or just a home site to recreational property.
For sure.
When I was a kid, nobody bought land just to recreate on. It was because there were so many places you could go hunting, and hunting wasn't considered really important. But, going off on a tangent here, but
no, that's okay. It's true.
My father really frowned upon wasting your time hunting. He felt that you should be working every single day except opening day of deer season and maybe a couple of Saturdays pheasant hunting. And that's all we did until I could hunt on my own.
Oh, how the times have changed.
And now, yeah, it's completely different. People are very serious about their land and the deer that are on that land. And people have gone into the food plotting big time. I was kind of around at the beginnings of mossy oak and what they were doing with seeds and bringing seeds from New Zealand and planting these exotics, like the brassicas. I didn't even know what the heck that stuff was, but, back in the 90s. And, there was a huge boom, and it's still going. It's still increasing. So I do a lot of food plot work.
Okay.
One of the toughest jobs I have is where folks want to have a food plot, but they can't because they're In Pennsylvania, you either have farmland or you have ridge or high plateau. So in some of these ridges, if you go south of here, this is all ridge and valley. So you either have sandstone up there or shale or
Right.
both. And then in the valleys is your limestone soils where you can actually grow crops. But I tell people all the time there's a reason why there's no farm up here, because the early settlers knew where to put their farm and where absolutely you don't put farms. So my job is to get the land cleared, get it de-rocked as best we can,
Mm-hmm.
and then start amending the soil. So it's a long, expensive, arduous project, and a lot of people don't understand what they're getting into a lot of times. But what I can do for a lot of clients, if they have timber, I can set up a timber sale, and then we take the profits and rotate that back into the land and make the habitat better. So logging can improve deer habitat just to start with, and then we take profits from a timber sale and we build food plots. I started out just putting food plots in all my log landings.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I got kind of interested in the food plotting thing. And then once in a while, you'd get a timber sale on a guy's place who had an old field, and then I'd be like, "Well, why don't you do something with this field?
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't have any cattle on it or anything." And once they found out what it cost to lime it and kill the rank grass that's on there, many times they just like, "What are you talking about? I'm not going to spend that kind of money on a food plot." But then that started to change, and now people call me specifically to get a food plot going.
And that's great. And that kind of really leads into what we're talking about right now in this series. So, kind of to recap you with what we've been doing, we started a series at the beginning of this year, and we're really talking about recapping your hunting season. Had some people I've talked with here recently that had poor experiences, kind of diminishing returns on that hunting property, and everyone that I've talked to, they want to try this, they want to try that, and they don't have a lot of direction. That's where somebody like you comes in to advise that. So, the first two episodes of this series, we kind of talked about conceptual access, making good access that's going to make sense to keep deer from seeing you, hearing you, smelling you on your property, and keep that property fresh as long as you possibly can. And then we kind of talked about the framework of food plots. And, I think what you were talking about with, creating food plot programs, number one, that were affordable, but actually giving people an idea of what that costs, what kind of investment that is, and setting up that structure. But those two things that we started in that first part, if you've got, let's say it's a 40, 50 acre parcel, you might be talking about less than 10, probably less than 5 acres of your property where you're trying to associate, food plots that are steering deer movement, creating daylight movement, a daylight food source, and then your access to try to prevent that. Really, what I really wanted to pick your brain about, you talked about that just briefly, is what are we doing with the rest of that property? Okay, how are we making it affordable, that we're cash flowing in a sense with making wildlife improvements, that we're not breaking the bank, and then what are the things that we need to be doing in those forest types to make quality cover, quality browse, because that's the meat and potatoes of this whole thing. So
Yeah, that's a good point, because food plots, we must always consider a food plot a supplemental. It's not ever going to provide a deer with all the food that it needs year round.
mm-hmm.
It's just a supplement to what's already out there. A food plot, and I've had this experience, does you no good if your forest management is not up to snuff. So most of the properties that I see, especially in Pennsylvania, have been high graded multiple times. And I'm working on a large project right now that's actually spanning 2 years of cutting just pulpwood. And luckily, the last time they cut it, white oak was not really worth anything, so they left it.
Mm-hmm.
So now I have a bunch of 12 to 14-inch white oak to work with, and there's a lot of it there. So I can thin everything down, get all the junk out of the woods, and I picked only the best white oaks and some maple,
Mm-hmm.
but not a lot of maple in that stand. but I just picked the high quality trees
Sure.
to keep. Everything else goes. So now there's tons of browse, and we put in some food plots with the money that we got from the pulpwood. So it's kind of it's a loser as far as making money. The guy is not making money. In fact, he has to put money into the project to get it finished.
But he's not as far in the hole.
But we put in about $20,000 worth of food plots on the property.
Okay.
Plus, the whole property is now a food plot because it's starting to regenerate, and we got enough land on 600 acres. We were able to cut about 400 of that. And then the rest is swamp. So you can imagine you got swamps, regenerated forest, and food plots. And he's quite happy with he killed a turkey and a big buck this year, had a chance at a big bear. Really happy with the results.
You created a lot of diversity and a lot of edge within that system to make it highly attractive. Now, you'd said about high grading. So in case somebody's just absolutely clueless to forestry, what were you referring to with high grading? You're talking about cutting the best, letting the rest?
Pretty much. That's one way to put it. In the past, people have sold timber either, and sometimes with a consultant, sometimes not.
Mm-hmm.
The worst thing you could possibly do is sell your timber to a logger and let him take whatever he wants. A logger or a sawmill, because they want to get everything they can possibly get while they're there. If you hire a forester and you have to communicate with your forester how you want it done, the forester can mark that such that in 20 years you can cut it again. And that's what I try to do. So what most people do, though, is they'll call up a logger and say, hey, I want to take my timber off. I want to sell my timber. Well, what the hell does that mean? You're just cutting the guy loose on your property. And I've seen so many destroyed properties, just the timber's ruined. And the habitat's no good either because they didn't take any of the pulpwood. So now you have what we call green junk growing. All the trees are poor. Around here, the valuable trees are oaks. So now you don't even have acorns. And sometimes it can create deer cover, sometimes it doesn't. It all depends on what the stocking level is. But most of the time, your quality has gone down. And I get on properties that have been high graded 3 times, and there's just nothing left. And now you're full of invasive grasses, which we can talk about. Grasses and shrubs that are taking over the forest right now. Things that deer don't eat, can't use them for anything. Right. There's no trees growing there. So we have that problem. So that's what high grading does. If you're not careful about how you go about a timber sale, I often tell landowners you can't put a tree back once it's cut down. So you got to be careful. You have to think through every tree that you mark. You got to look around and see why you're marking that tree to take. And that's where a good forester comes in.
That is where a good forester comes in. So I'm going to kind of give you an analogy. Let's say, I'm just some Joe Schmo. I don't really know much about forestry, but I bought this property and I want it 100% for deer hunting. That is the whole sole reason why I have this property. Kind of a dominant oak hickory forest, and I heard or I read somewhere online that you're going to get, for a good quality whitetail property, you're going to get one good cutting out of it, and then after that, you're not going to get that. Kind of an interesting concept, and I don't necessarily say I agree with it, but I've heard that a lot. I'd love your take on that, because there's this, I think, a misconception that you can't have your cake and eat it too when it comes to managing your forest and also managing it for whitetails. What are your thoughts?
Well, you can have it all, but it depends on what you're starting out with.
Yeah.
I know of one guy who, if I were him, I would sell his property and get something better to hunt on.
Okay.
Frankly.
What kind of property is that comes to your mind, like as far as forest type, age of the forest type thing?
That place has a lot of problems.
Okay.
Mostly it's the neighbors.
I see.
They want to ride their 4-wheelers all over the place, and he lets them cut through his place to get to their land they have land on either side. So now you have like a racetrack up
Sure.
and down, and they're up and down all day long. And you can't have a big buck around there. It won't happen because they know what's up. In the middle of October, when all that traffic starts up, then you can't keep a big buck bedded down in there.
Without it, for sure.
So that's one property that comes to mind. That property, however, has a ton of big oak on it.
Okay.
And he doesn't want to cut it because he thinks that acorns are the be-all and end-all of deer food. But I can tell you that acorns are one of the most unreliable food sources in the woods.
Without a doubt.
Not a big fan of managing for oak because I would rather manage for diversity, young timber that is less than 6 feet tall, so deer can browse on it. And you can maintain that type of timber stand with brush hogs and mulchers and things like that. I would rather sell some oak and build a food plot because you're going to get reliable food sources that you can draw deer to every single year. And those deer grow up around there, and bucks will move into that area, and they know where the food is, they know where the does are hanging out, and it concentrates the deer and makes them flow a certain way so that you can hunt them.
Sure. Yeah, that you hit the two nails on the head, and that's kind of what we were really talking about in our last two episodes was, number one, making sure pressure is managed to hold the deer there because you're not going to chase him. Number two, that consistent food source. And we talked about that necessarily in sense of food plots, but really your daytime food, daytime cover is coming from that forestry generation.
You know, if you ask me what the number one problem that I see out there with landowners is having a lack of undisturbed area on their property where deer can feel safe. The other thing is that everybody wants to hunt on top of the food plot because that's where the deer are coming. But what you find is that they get wise to that pretty quick. And, you know, just for example, I was down in Georgia and nobody had been hunting in there for a couple of weeks. I got into a blind looking over some food, saw a ton of deer that first night. The next night I saw some deer. The next night I saw zero until dark, it was dark 30. They knew I was there, and I've had that happen to me up here too in Pennsylvania where, I'm guilty of the same thing. You want to hunt where you see a lot of deer because it's fun to see deer.
Sure.
But you have to get out of the habit of hunting on your food. You want to have your food at one end of the property and your cover at the other end. Come in from the sides and hunt in between. That way you have reliable traffic. But as soon as you go nocturnal on your property, now you have to get off the property for about 2 weeks until everything settles down again. And we don't have time for that.
For sure. You absolutely hit the nail on the head there. Now, we talked about keeping and holding deer, pressure and food. So when you talked about that regeneration, we go to the property you described with some oak, managing for oak but getting good regeneration. People really don't understand or really know what's coming back in Pennsylvania. Like when you go to some of them cuts and you're trying to keep stuff under 6 feet, like what are you trying to replace it with that's going to be quality for whitetails?
Well, it's very difficult to regenerate on small properties without deer-proof fencing. So, and it's a real big problem because sometimes I get a fence funded through NRCS and we put up a fence, but now you can't hunt that area. Okay. The regeneration is coming up and the funded fences from the government, they want to have timber growing. Okay?
Right. They're managing boards per foot.
They want it above deer browse height before you can take the fence down. But that's not what we want. We want to fence the deer out, plant shrubs that are missing from the landscape, keep up with the invasives, and then have new trees growing, and treat it like a garden inside the fence, and then take the fence down. I like to use about 5 years.
Okay.
So if you have to have a fence up, if your contract with NRCS says you have to leave the fence up for 15 years, I tell them forget it.
Right.
Now the problem that we have, and I have areas like this that I tried to regenerate without a fence, and the deer ate all the trees, virtually everything, even low browse species, low desirable browse species like birch, cherry, that stuff didn't grow, and then you end up with ferns. So now you got a fern problem because of the deer. So now you got to start from scratch. You got to kill the ferns, try to eliminate the deer somehow. But unless you can, like for instance, up in the state land, when you go north of here, there's a really good silviculture guy working on those properties where we had gypsy moth kill. There's a lot of standing dead timber up there, and he's doing huge clear cuts. He's just cutting 100 acres at a time. Then they bring a crew in from South America, and they plant pines and spruce.
Interesting.
So in Pennsylvania, the climax forest is actually pine and hemlock, but hemlock's getting the woolly adelgid problem, so we don't want to plant that. So they plant Norway spruce, which is something that's a great tree that just nothing kills it. It grows everywhere, and it's just hard to beat. Now, white pine is native to the area and also doesn't have a lot of problems. So what you end up with when you can clear cut 100 acres and give out lots and lots of DMAP tags, there's hardly any deer up there, and people are upset. They're upset about that. There's not a lot of deer, but the deer population is actually correct for the range. So now trees can grow. And he's getting excellent results on regenerating oak and maple and other species. But now if that was a deer property, at this point I would be going in and working on putting in food plots. I would be putting in some trails with a forestry mulcher to get deer to move a certain way.
Sure.
When they're bedding in there. Because right now you got a 100-acre clear cut that's dog hair thick. You can't see a deer 10 yards away. So that's a problem. So you have to, like I said before, nurture these regeneration areas like it's a garden. Constantly have to be weeding, adding new things, and keeping the deer at bay somehow. Even if you have to go and get a bunch of DMAT tags and just hammer the does for a while till you get some mouths off the range, and then let your population come back up when you have better food.
Certainly. Now there's a lot of different forest types. There's a lot of variation in the diversity across Pennsylvania landscape. Like where I'm from here in the southern part of the state, we do have a lot more ag. We have a lot more lowland, early succession vegetative stuff, bordering oak, hickory, mountain ground. And I think we have the ability slightly to vary where deer spend more time throughout certain parts of the season. Now, some of the places like central and northern Pennsylvania, it's like all the same habitat type. So it's just a solid block forest. So really you're talking about managing the number of mouths. When you're making those improvements, you're talking about that's the best food source in the area. That's the struggle. Am I understanding you right?
Yeah. I mean, as soon as you cut and you start getting regeneration, the deer focus on it. It's like a giant food plot. They all come in there and start eating on it. And if it's too small, then they just eat you out of house and home.
To the point where the next thing that fills into that seed base is invasives, right?
Usually.
Yeah. So one of the big problems, and one of the things I called you about and talked to you on the phone about a couple months ago, was a problem that we have on one of the properties that I hunt. and that's Japanese stiltgrass. But Japanese stiltgrass is just one of many invasive problems.
Well, I used to think that things like barberry and autumn olive were a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even look at them anymore because Japanese stiltgrass has worked its way into every nook and cranny. And the further south you go, like down where you guys are,
Yeah.
it's crazy down there. And what's happening is that stiltgrass is able to travel in dust. The seeds will get on dust of equipment, four-wheelers. And I really think it's four-wheelers that are the worst culprit because people, they go from one place to the other and they drive all their trails, and that's where you see the stiltgrass. It's, it's on the trails. And if you have a logging job, it comes in on the equipment and they basically just plant it all over the place. So they're disturbing soil and putting stiltgrass seeds down, and it just goes nuts. It's too bad that deer don't like it, because otherwise it would be a miracle food plot thing. Now, there's a guy who I did some work for. I did a forest management plan for him, and he does a lot of work on his property. He plants a lot of oak trees. He propagates them and plants them out, puts them in tubes. You know, he's really working on the place. And he told me that he mixed up some Kool-Aid and sprayed it on stiltgrass, and the deer ate it. So I'm going to experiment with that, and I'm going to try to come up with a concoction that I can spray on stiltgrass that would make it attractive to deer and see if they'll eat it.
Well, that's interesting.
But right now, I mean, we end up with a deer-selected forest. In other words, the deer eat everything they like to the point where it can't grow anymore, like stump sprouts. You know, that got to be a little bit of a fad recently where they would call them mineral stumps, right? A mineral stump is nothing more than a stump sprout. You know, you cut a tree down that's a vigorous sprouter like an oak.
Yeah.
That's candy to a deer. It's just the best browse there is. And I'm sure you've seen stumps in the woods that just have like a little brush going around the outside of the stump, and that's from deer just every year picking off the buds. But that's a tree that should be regrowing and should be 10 feet tall, but the deer ate it. And after a while, it can't feed the roots anymore because it's not putting out any leaves, and it dies. To listen to the rest of this podcast, go to Pennsylvania Woodlands at Sportsman's Nation or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Be sure and hit the like and subscribe button and click on the bell so you'll be notified when there's a new video. And comment down below and let me know if there's anything you'd like to know more about.